Welcome to tonight's story. In 1838, deep in the American South, an entire plantation family fell violently ill after a quiet evening meal, and by morning, several of them were dead. The whispers began almost instantly. At the center of those whispers was one name, Abigail Turner. But was she a cold-blooded poisoner, a desperate woman pushed beyond survival, or the victim of a narrative written by those in power? Before we uncover what really happened, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these true stories travel. And please subscribe, because every episode you see here comes from deep research, cross-checking historical records, and hours of digging into forgotten archives to bring you the most accurate version of events possible. In 1838, plantations across the American South operated like isolated kingdoms, ruled by a single white family whose word carried the force of law. These estates were often miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by acres of cotton or tobacco fields that stretched beyond sight. The main house stood elevated and imposing, built not only as a home, but as a symbol of dominance. Beneath its polished wooden floors and tall columns existed a hidden system of controlled fear and forced labor that sustained its wealth. Life on a plantation followed a strict hierarchy. At the top were the owners and their relatives, followed by overseers who enforced discipline in the fields. Below them were skilled enslaved workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, whose labor kept the estate functioning. At the bottom were field hands, forced to work from sunrise to sunset under brutal supervision. Every movement, every task, every breath was regulated by rules designed to prevent resistance and maintain total authority. The physical layout of the plantation reinforced this power structure. The grand house was often placed at the highest visible point, overlooking rows of crops and the small, cramped cabins where enslaved people lived. These cabins were built from rough wood, poorly insulated, and crowded with families who had little privacy and even less comfort. The distance between the big house and the quarters was symbolic as well as physical, a constant reminder of inequality. Food production and preparation were also tightly controlled. The plantation kitchen was one of the most important spaces on the estate, especially in larger households. Meals for the owner's family were elaborate and carefully prepared, often by enslaved women who had access to ingredients, utensils, and occasionally substances that could be dangerous if misused. While enslaved workers were denied freedom, those assigned to domestic labor operated within the heart of the household, seeing and hearing far more than field workers ever could. Communication beyond the plantation was limited. News traveled slowly, and law enforcement was often distant or influenced by plantation elites. This isolation meant that events occurring within plantation boundaries could be shaped into whatever narrative the owners declared. If illness, death, or conflict emerged, the official explanation rarely faced serious challenge from outside authorities. Medical knowledge in 1838 was primitive compared to modern standards. Sudden illness could easily be blamed on contaminated food, natural disease, spoiled water, or intentional poisoning, often without solid evidence. Symptoms such as vomiting, fever, or convulsions were mysterious and terrifying, feeding both superstition and suspicion. In such an environment, fear could spread faster than truth. This was the tense and tightly controlled world in which Abigail Turner lived. A place where power was absolute, justice was unequal, and survival often depended on silence. When tragedy struck a plantation household in 1838, it did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded within a system already built on imbalance, secrecy, and fear. Very little was officially recorded about Abigail Turner before the events of 1838, and that silence itself speaks volumes. Enslaved people were rarely documented as individuals. They were listed as property, counted in inventories, and described in terms of age, labor ability, or monetary value. If Abigail's name appeared anywhere, it was likely in a ledger beside numbers, not memories, not emotions, not a life story. Her identity, like so many others, was filtered through the perspective of those who claimed ownership over her existence. Abigail Turner was believed to have been a domestic enslaved woman, assigned to work inside the plantation household rather than in the fields. Domestic labor was physically different from field labor, but it was not easier. It required constant presence, constant obedience, and constant awareness. A woman in this position cooked meals, cleaned rooms, washed clothing, tended fires, and sometimes cared for the children of the very family that enslaved her. She moved through the intimate spaces of the home while never belonging to it. Unlike field hands who worked under the open sky, Abigail's world revolved around the kitchen and service areas of the main house. The kitchen was both a place of labor and a place of risk. She handled ingredients, herbs, and household supplies daily. She would have known which foods were fresh, which were spoiled, and which substances in storage were dangerous. That proximity to the family's meals later became central to suspicion, whether fairly or unfairly. Her age at the time is uncertain, but many domestic enslaved women were in their late teens to early 30s, considered physically strong enough for labor, yet experienced enough to manage household responsibilities. If Abigail had been born into slavery, 1838 would not have been the beginning of her suffering, but simply another year within it. If she had been sold to the plantation later in life, she may have carried memories of separation from family, one of the deepest and most common traumas of enslavement. Socially, Abigail would have existed in a constant state of vulnerability. Enslaved women faced not only physical exhaustion, but also the threat of punishment for the smallest perceived disobedience. Speaking too freely, moving too slowly, or even appearing resentful could invite violence. The domestic setting did not protect them. In some cases, it placed them even closer to unpredictable authority. At the same time, domestic workers often became silent observers of plantation life. They overheard arguments, financial worries, illnesses, and secrets whispered behind closed doors. They saw tensions within the household that outsiders never would. This unique position could create complicated dynamics, resentment, familiarity, forced intimacy, or quiet resistance. Whether Abigail harbored anger, fear, or simple exhaustion is something the records do not clearly tell us. What history leaves behind is a shadowed outline of a woman whose life was shaped by a system designed to erase her voice. Before the accusations, before the rumors, before her name became tied to mysterious deaths, Abigail Turner was first and foremost a human being living under bondage. Understanding who she was means acknowledging not just the suspicion surrounding her, but the harsh world that defined her daily existence long before tragedy struck. The first signs that something was wrong appeared quietly, almost deceptively ordinary. Members of the Plantation family began complaining of stomach pain late in the evening, not long after supper had been served. At first, it was dismissed as indigestion or spoiled food, an inconvenience rather than a threat. But as the hours passed, the discomfort intensified into violent nausea, cramping, and waves of weakness that left them unable to stand. By midnight, the situation had grown alarming. Vomiting became relentless, accompanied by dizziness and cold sweats. One family member reportedly collapsed near the dining room corridor, unable to steady themselves. Servants were ordered to fetch water, cloths, and whatever home remedies were available. In 1838, medical help was not immediately accessible, especially on remote plantations, so families relied on household treatments and prayer while hoping the symptoms would pass. Instead of improving, the illness spread. Whether everyone had eaten the same dish or shared the same drink became an urgent question whispered through the house. The speed at which multiple individuals fell sick fueled fear. Sudden group illness was not common, and when it did occur, it often pointed to contamination or something more deliberate. Panic began to replace confusion. As dawn approached, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. One member of the family was unresponsive, breathing shallowly. Another was delirious, speaking incoherently, and unable to recognize those around them. The once orderly plantation home, typically ruled by strict routine, descended into chaos. Orders were shouted, footsteps echoed through hallways, and the atmosphere shifted from irritation to terror. When word finally reached a nearby physician, hours too late for some, he arrived to a scene already marked by death. Without modern diagnostic tools, doctors in 1838 relied on observation. Severe gastrointestinal distress, weakness, and rapid decline often suggested poisoning, but similar symptoms could also result from foodborne illness or contaminated water. Still, the clustering of cases within a single household sharpened suspicion immediately. As the sun rose fully over the plantation, news began to spread beyond the main house. Enslaved workers in the quarters heard fragments of information. The family was gravely ill, perhaps dying. Rumors grew quickly, shaped by fear and uncertainty. On isolated estates, tragedy never stayed contained. It moved like wind through fields and cabins, carrying speculation with it. By the end of that day, at least one life had been lost, possibly more depending on the account. The suddenness of the deaths shocked everyone connected to the plantation. What had begun as an ordinary evening meal had transformed into a deadly mystery. And in an environment already built on mistrust and rigid power, the question was no longer just what happened, but who could be blamed. The evening of the final dinner began, like many others on the plantation, structured, predictable, and bound by routine. The table was set with care, polished silver laid beside ceramic plates, candles flickering against the walls of the dining room. Meals in plantation households were not simply about nourishment, they were displays of status and control. The food served that night would have reflected the resources of the estate: fresh vegetables from the garden, preserved meats, cornbread, perhaps a stew seasoned carefully in the kitchen hours before it reached the table. Preparation for such a dinner began long before the family gathered to eat. In the heat of the kitchen, enslaved workers labored over open flames, stirring pots, and monitoring ovens. Recipes were followed from memory, passed down or learned through repetition. Every ingredient was handled manually, washed, chopped, seasoned. In 1838, kitchens lacked modern sanitation standards, meaning contamination from spoiled food or unclean water was always a possibility. Yet when tragedy followed a shared meal, suspicion rarely began with accident. Witness accounts, if they were recorded accurately, suggest that nothing appeared unusual about the dishes themselves. There was no strange taste noted at the table, no immediate reaction after the first bite. Conversation reportedly flowed as it normally did. The family ate together, unaware that this ordinary ritual would soon be remembered as their final shared meal. The absence of an obvious warning only deepened the mystery later. After dinner, servants cleared plates and returned leftovers to storage. If poison had been present, it left no visible trace. Many toxins known in the 19th century, such as arsenic, were colorless and could be mixed into food or drink without altering appearance significantly. However, such substances were not easily obtained by enslaved individuals without raising suspicion, which complicates the narrative that later formed around Abigail Turner. Within an hour or two of finishing the meal, the first symptoms reportedly appeared: a complaint of stomach pain, a sudden wave of nausea. At first, it may have been brushed aside as simple indigestion from rich food. Plantation dinners were often heavy and seasoned strongly, and discomfort after eating was not unheard of. But what began as mild unease escalated far beyond normal sickness. As the illness intensified, the memory of that dinner became central to every conversation in the house. Family members tried to recall who had eaten what, who had poured the drinks, who had remained in the kitchen. Ordinary details, who carried which dish to the table, suddenly felt significant. Fear sharpened memory, but it also distorted it. In moments of panic, people searched desperately for patterns. By morning, that final dinner was no longer just a meal. It was the dividing line between life and death. Every bite taken that night became part of a narrative that demanded explanation. Whether the cause was deliberate poisoning, accidental contamination, or something else entirely, the event transformed a routine evening into a moment frozen in suspicion. And from that moment forward, the question lingered heavily in the air: what exactly had been served at that table? Suspicion did not wait for evidence. In the tense hours after the deaths, whispers began circulating inside the plantation house. When tragedy strikes suddenly, especially in a controlled and hierarchical environment, people look for someone to blame. On a plantation in 1838, blame rarely moved upward. It moved downward, toward those with the least power to defend themselves. Because the illness followed a shared meal, attention quickly shifted to the kitchen. Who had prepared the food? Who had handled the ingredients? Who had access to the family's plates before they were served? These questions narrowed the focus almost immediately to the enslaved domestic workers. Among them, Abigail Turner's name rose to the surface, not necessarily because of proof, but because of proximity. Fear has a way of shaping memory. Some may have claimed they noticed something unusual about her behavior that evening. Perhaps she seemed quiet, distracted, or tense. In reality, such observations are often reconstructed after the fact. A normal glance becomes suspicious. Silence becomes secrecy. In moments of panic, ordinary human expressions are reinterpreted through the lens of guilt. There may also have been underlying tensions long before the incident. Enslaved women working in domestic spaces endured constant pressure and potential mistreatment. Any previous disagreement, punishment, or perceived attitude could suddenly be reframed as motive. In a society built on domination, the idea of revenge was both feared and exaggerated. Plantation owners lived with the unspoken awareness that those they oppressed had reason to resent them. Medical uncertainty intensified the accusations. Without clear scientific testing, a physician's suggestion of poisoning, even cautious or speculative, could harden into certainty in the minds of a grieving family. If symptoms resembled known toxins, that was often enough to ignite blame. And once the word poison entered conversation, suspicion became almost impossible to reverse. For Abigail Turner, being accused meant facing not only legal danger, but immediate physical threat. Enslaved individuals did not receive the presumption of innocence. Interrogations could involve intimidation or violence. Testimony from enslaved people was often dismissed unless it supported the narrative of the owners. If Abigail denied wrongdoing, her words carried little weight against the fear and anger of the household. As the plantation community absorbed the news, the accusation began solidifying into a story: the trusted kitchen worker who turned deadly. Whether this version emerged from evidence or from collective fear is difficult to determine. But once suspicion settled on her, it spread quickly beyond the walls of the house. In a system already built on inequality, it did not take much for rumor to transform into accusation, and accusation into assumed guilt. On a plantation in 1838, the kitchen was more than a workspace. It was the operational heart of the household. Every meal, every preserved ingredient, every carefully prepared dish passed through it. Enslaved women assigned to kitchen labor carried enormous responsibility. They managed fires that burned from before sunrise until late at night, balanced multiple dishes at once, and ensured that the family's expectations were met without error. A single mistake could result in punishment. Kitchen labor required skill and precision. Cooking over open hearths demanded constant attention to heat and timing. Ingredients were stored in cellars, pantries, and smokehouses, and the cook had to know which items were safe to use and which had spoiled. In an era without refrigeration, food safety depended heavily on experience and judgment. This meant that the cook, often an enslaved woman, held specialized knowledge that even the plantation owners did not fully understand. Because of this responsibility, kitchen workers occupied a complicated position within plantation life. They were physically closer to the enslavers than field hands were. They entered the main house daily, overheard conversations, and observed the private lives of the family. This proximity sometimes created the illusion of trust, but it did not translate into equality or protection. Instead, it meant constant surveillance and higher expectations. Access was central to later suspicion. Kitchen workers handled spices, flour, preserved meats, and occasionally medicinal substances stored for household use. Some plantations kept items such as rat poison, lye, or arsenic based compounds for agricultural or pest control purposes. Though tightly controlled, these substances existed within the broader environment. The mere fact that a kitchen worker had proximity to ingredients and preparation tools made them an easy target for accusations involving contamination. At the same time, domestic enslaved women endured immense psychological strain. They prepared meals for those who controlled every aspect of their lives. They served plates to people who might punish them hours later. They cared for children who would grow up believing they owned them. This forced intimacy could generate layers of silent resentment or emotional numbness, though history rarely records those inner experiences directly. In plantation society, the kitchen was also a place of quiet communication among enslaved workers. It was one of the few semi-private spaces where brief exchanges could happen away from the fields. Stories, warnings, and shared frustrations might circulate there in hushed tones. However, any suggestion that such communication equaled conspiracy was often exaggerated by fearful owners who viewed any unity among enslaved people as a threat. When the plantation family fell ill, the significance of kitchen labor became central. The very skills and responsibilities that made domestic workers indispensable were turned against them. The kitchen, once simply a place of heat and routine, became framed as a potential crime scene. In a system built on mistrust and imbalance, the role of the cook shifted overnight, from essential labor to primary suspect, based largely on access rather than proven intent. In 1838, medical science was still developing, and the understanding of toxins was limited and often inconsistent. Physicians relied heavily on observation rather than laboratory testing. When patients presented with violent vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness, or convulsions, doctors could only compare the symptoms to known cases they had previously encountered. Without chemical analysis determining whether an illness was caused by poison, spoiled food, or infectious disease was largely a matter of educated guesswork. Arsenic was one of the most commonly discussed poisons in the 19th century. It was used in small quantities for pest control and sometimes even in medicinal compounds. Because it was colorless and could dissolve into food or drink without dramatically altering taste, it earned a reputation as a silent toxin. However, the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, severe stomach distress, diarrhea, dehydration, closely resembled those of cholera or foodborne illness, which were also common at the time. Cholera outbreaks had swept through parts of the United States in the 1830s, and gastrointestinal illness was not unusual in rural areas. Contaminated wells, improperly stored food, and poor sanitation created constant risk. A shared meal followed by multiple cases of sickness could easily be attributed to spoiled meat or tainted water. Yet when death occurred quickly and dramatically, suspicion often leaned toward intentional harm rather than natural contamination. Physicians in 1838 had limited tools for confirming poison. Some rudimentary tests existed, such as examining stomach contents for visible residues, but these methods were unreliable and not widely standardized. In many cases, a doctor's conclusion was shaped by the context, who had motive, who had access, and what the family believed. Medical opinion could unintentionally reinforce social bias. The speed of decline also influenced assumptions. If a patient deteriorated rapidly within hours, poison seemed more plausible. but severe dehydration from vomiting or bacterial contamination could also lead to shock and death, especially without effective treatment. Intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and modern emergency care did not exist. Once the body weakened beyond a certain point, survival was uncertain. Public fear of poisoning during this period was heightened by sensational stories circulated in newspapers and local gossip. Poison was seen as both terrifying and treacherous because it suggested betrayal from within. Unlike violence in the fields or open rebellion, poisoning implied secrecy and access to the most intimate space of all, the dinner table. This cultural fear made accusations particularly powerful, even in the absence of conclusive proof. In the case of the plantation deaths, medical understanding alone could not provide absolute answers. A doctor might have suspected poisoning based on symptoms, but suspicion did not equal certainty. Without modern forensic science, the line between fact and assumption remained blurred. In such an uncertain environment, medical opinion could easily become the foundation for accusation, shaping a narrative that history would struggle to untangle centuries later. Witness testimonies from the plantation, if they existed at all, were often fragmented, biased, and filtered through fear. In 1838, the lives of enslaved people were rarely documented with care or precision, and those who spoke out risked punishment or death. What little could be recorded came primarily from the perspective of the plantation owners or overseers, whose observations were shaped by their own suspicions, prejudices, and desire to maintain control. Every account had to be read with the understanding that the narrator's loyalties and fears could distort reality. Those who survived the night of illness, the remaining family members, servants, and field workers offered conflicting statements. Some may have insisted they saw Abigail Turner behaving nervously or unusually in the kitchen, while others recalled her performing her duties as usual. Memory in moments of crisis is notoriously unreliable, and the terror of seeing loved ones fall ill quickly could warp perception. Simple gestures or facial expressions might have been misinterpreted as guilt or foreknowledge. Even the enslaved individuals who worked alongside Abigail would have been careful in how they spoke. Discussing suspicions openly could be interpreted as disloyalty, and any hint that they questioned the family's version of events might bring punishment. Therefore, the testimonies from the quarters were often silenced, altered, or conveyed through intermediaries, leaving gaps in the record that later observers filled with speculation. Conflicting accounts likely arose over the timing and sequence of events. Who first fell ill, what they ate, and who served the dishes could all vary depending on who was recounting the story. Small discrepancies in these narratives could grow into suspicion. When fear was high, each testimony, whether accurate or not, was scrutinized for signs of motive or negligence, especially against those in the kitchen with direct access to the family's meals. Children in the household, if present, could also contribute to the confusion. Their statements might have been unreliable due to age or misunderstanding, yet adults often interpreted them as clues. Similarly, the chaos of the night, the panic, the screams, and the frantic efforts to care for the sick made clear recollection nearly impossible. What was remembered and what was imagined became intertwined. The reliance on testimony in 1838 was complicated further by social hierarchy. White witnesses' accounts were given unquestioned authority, while enslaved voices were dismissed unless they aligned with the interests of the family or legal authorities. This imbalance meant that the narrative of guilt or innocence was shaped less by objective fact and more by the perceptions of those in power. Ultimately, the witness testimonies contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion that defined the aftermath of the tragedy. Contradictions, exaggerations, and silences all fueled the story that would be passed down through history. Whether Abigail Turner was guilty or merely present at the wrong place and time, the way people recalled and recounted events created a powerful, enduring narrative that blended reality, rumor, and assumption into a single, haunting memory of that night. Speculation about Abigail Turner's motives quickly became central to the story, though determining intent in 1838 was almost impossible. In a society built on slavery, enslaved individuals were often assumed to harbor hidden resentment, regardless of their actual feelings or actions. Any sudden misfortune affecting the family could easily be interpreted as the outcome of revenge, whether real or imagined. The idea that Abigail might have deliberately harmed the family fit neatly into the fears and prejudices of the era, even if there was no concrete evidence. Revenge is a concept often attributed to enslaved people in historical accounts, sometimes accurately, but often exaggerated. Plantation owners and overseers feared retaliation for every act of cruelty, every punishment, every forced separation from family members. This fear could turn ordinary accidents or illnesses into sinister plots in the collective imagination of those in power. Abigail's proximity to the household, combined with her knowledge of the family's routines and access to food, made her a convenient figure onto which such fears could be projected. Survival may also have been a hidden, unspoken motive. Enslaved women frequently faced impossible choices to protect themselves or their families. While there is no direct evidence that Abigail acted to save herself, the extreme pressures of domestic labor, constant scrutiny, and the threat of punishment created an environment where desperate measures might be considered. Historians must weigh the difference between action taken in defiance and action taken in defense of life or dignity. Scapegoating was another likely factor shaping assumptions about motive. When tragedy struck a plantation, blaming an individual enslaved worker allowed the owners to maintain control and absolve themselves of responsibility. By attributing malice to Abigail, the family could externalize fear and anxiety rather than confronting the chaotic and sometimes unsafe conditions that contributed to illness. This process of assigning blame often ignored nuance, creating a narrative that was simpler and more frightening. Rumors, already a powerful force on isolated plantations, fueled assumptions about intent. Even unverified accounts of Abigail Turner acting strangely or expressing anger could be interpreted as evidence of malicious planning. In a community under strict surveillance and limited freedom, small actions were magnified into symbols of guilt. Stories grew in the telling, and what may have been routine behavior was reframed as premeditated. Psychological pressures also shaped perception of motive. Family members, fearful for their lives and struggling with grief, needed an explanation. Humans naturally search for cause when confronted with sudden, inexplicable tragedy. Abigail, present in the household and intimately involved with daily life, fit the role of a possible culprit. Whether this perception matched reality is impossible to confirm, but it dominated the narrative. Ultimately, the question of Abigail Turner's motive remains shrouded in uncertainty. Historians and storytellers are left to interpret a life erased by systemic oppression and fear. Revenge, survival, and scapegoating all intersected to create the image of intent. But separating fact from assumption is nearly impossible. The ambiguity surrounding her motives is part of what makes the story both haunting and historically significant, reflecting the tensions, fears, and injustices of the plantation world. If a formal trial took place following the deaths on the plantation, it would have reflected the extreme inequalities of 1838 Southern justice. Enslaved individuals were rarely granted the same legal rights as white citizens. In cases of alleged wrongdoing, the burden of proof often rested not on the accuser, but on the accused, leaving little room for defense. Even if Abigail Turner had supporters or witnesses willing to speak on her behalf, their voices would have been considered far less credible simply because of their enslaved status. Court proceedings at the time were heavily influenced by social hierarchy and fear. Plantation owners and their overseers were given deference in testimony, while enslaved individuals could be coerced into confessing or providing statements under threat of punishment. The very act of accusing someone like Abigail could be enough to determine guilt in the eyes of the law. Regardless of tangible evidence, courts were designed to reinforce existing power structures rather than seek objective truth. Documentation of such trials was often incomplete or biased. Official records might list charges, names, and verdicts but rarely included context or nuanced accounts of events. Enslaved people were identified by first name or vague descriptors, and their personal perspectives were omitted. This lack of documentation makes it difficult for historians to reconstruct what actually happened, leaving a story shaped largely by rumor, speculation, and the surviving accounts of those in power. The trial, if it occurred, would likely have centered on testimonies about Abigail's access to food, her behavior on the day of the deaths, and the perceived symptoms of the victims. Questions about motive, timing, and opportunity were intertwined with assumptions of malice. Evidence that today would be considered circumstantial or insufficient, such as nervous behavior or mere proximity to the meals, could have been treated as conclusive proof in the 19th century courtroom. Public sentiment also influenced legal outcomes. Neighbors, workers, and community members often attended hearings, and fear of similar tragedies could fuel a presumption of guilt. Courts did not operate in a vacuum. Social pressure, rumor, and the desire for swift resolution shaped the proceedings. In cases involving enslaved defendants, the trial could serve as a warning to others, reinforcing obedience and deterring perceived disloyalty. If Abigail Turner was convicted, the punishment would likely have been severe and intended as both retribution and deterrent. Enslaved individuals accused of harming their owners were often subjected to execution, whipping, or sale to harsher conditions. The consequences were extreme, reflecting the belief that the stability of the plantation and the social order itself was at stake. Even an acquittal could not undo the damage done by accusation as fear and suspicion lingered long after the court left town. Regardless of the legal outcome, the idea of a trial reinforced the power dynamics of the plantation system. It illustrated how law, justice, and authority were wielded not to uncover truth, but to maintain control. Abigail Turner's story, filtered through incomplete records and social bias, becomes a lens through which we see both the cruelty of slavery and the fragility of human life in a system where one accusation could decide fate. Rumors spread like wildfire across the plantation after the mysterious deaths, fueled by fear, grief, and the desire for answers. In 1838, isolated estates were tight, knit communities where news traveled quickly, often distorted with each retelling. Every worker, field hand, or household servant who had seen Abigail Turner moving through the house became a potential witness in whispered speculation. The mere mention of poisoning sent a ripple of panic through both the enslaved and free populations associated with the plantation. Fear played a central role in shaping these rumors. The sudden illness and deaths were terrifying precisely because they were inexplicable. In an environment already defined by hierarchy and oppression, the idea that someone within the household might have turned against the family was unthinkable, yet plausible. It created a sense of vulnerability that people tried to manage by focusing suspicion on a single individual, the domestic worker closest to the meals. These whispers were amplified by cultural perceptions of enslaved women. They were often portrayed in plantation narratives as cunning, resentful, or capable of subtle forms of resistance. Such stereotypes made it easier for observers to believe that Abigail could intentionally poison her employers, even without concrete evidence. The fear of hidden malice transformed ordinary behavior into proof of guilt in the minds of many. Isolation of the plantation also intensified the spread of rumor. With limited communication beyond the estate, there was no independent verification of events. Neighbors might hear fragments of the story and add their interpretations, while enslaved individuals might quietly speculate among themselves, careful not to speak openly. Each retelling added layers of exaggeration or assumption, solidifying a narrative that may have been far from reality. Rumors also served a social function. They reinforced control. By identifying Abigail as the possible culprit, the family and overseers could channel communal fear into a clear target. This diverted attention from broader systemic issues, such as unsafe conditions, insufficient medical knowledge, or even their own role in creating a stressful, oppressive environment that could contribute to illness. Scapegoating became both a coping mechanism and a means of preserving authority. Over time, these stories became ingrained in the memory of the plantation community. Even those who were unsure of Abigail's guilt repeated the narrative, because it offered a tidy explanation for chaos that otherwise seemed senseless. The repetition of these tales ensured that rumor evolved into history, forming the foundation of the legend that would surround her name for generations. Ultimately, the combination of fear, prejudice, and isolation allowed rumor to dominate reality. The uncertainty surrounding the deaths, coupled with the existing power dynamics, meant that Abigail Turner was caught in a web of suspicion from which escape was nearly impossible. Whether she acted maliciously or not became secondary to the story constructed by those who survived and the haunting shadow of those rumors would linger long after the plantation quieted. How history remembered Abigail Turner is as much a story of erasure as it is of accusation. Enslaved individuals rarely had their lives recorded in meaningful detail. Their experiences, emotions, and perspectives were considered irrelevant by the people controlling the written record. When tragedies occurred, the focus of historical documentation was almost always on the family, their losses, and the legal or social consequences for the enslaved person accused. Abigail Turner's voice, if it ever existed in any record, was largely silenced. The narrative that survived was filtered through fear, rumor, and bias. Plantation owners and local chroniclers often painted enslaved people as either loyal or dangerous, obedient or vengeful. These simplistic portrayals ignored the complexity of their lives and choices. In Abigail's case, the story of a woman allegedly poisoning her employers fit neatly into existing stereotypes, ensuring that her identity was reduced to a single act of alleged malice rather than a full human life. Over time, retellings blurred the line between fact and legend. Some accounts emphasized the horror of the deaths, embellishing details of the night of illness and the final dinner. Others speculated endlessly about motive, access, and intent. Because primary sources were scarce and those that existed were biased, each retelling layered assumptions onto a found complete information. Abigail Turner became less a person and more a symbol, a figure onto which fears of rebellion, betrayal, and vengeance were projected. Historical erasure was compounded by the lack of legal records. If a trial occurred, court documents would have been brief, procedural, and often dismissive of her perspective. If she was punished without trial, as happened in some cases, her fate might only be hinted at in passing mentions in ledgers or letters. Without detailed records, historians are forced to reconstruct events from scattered fragments, reading between lines written by those with power rather than empathy. Despite these limitations, Abigail Turner's story has persisted because it touches on universal themes: oppression, fear, survival, and the consequences of systemic injustice. Her narrative represents countless other enslaved individuals whose lives and deaths were reduced to rumor, accusation, or shorthand in estate records. Each retelling attempts, in some way, to fill in the gaps left by history, while acknowledging that complete accuracy may be impossible. Modern interpretation often struggles to separate the woman from the myth. Was Abigail a calculated avenger, a desperate survivor, or simply a scapegoat for forces beyond her control? Without direct evidence, each possibility remains open, illustrating how historical narratives are shaped as much by those who record them as by the events themselves. Her story becomes a lens through which we can examine the broader injustices of the plantation system and the ways in which marginalized voices are systematically erased. In the end, Abigail Turner's legacy is both haunting and instructive. It is a reminder that history is rarely neutral, and that the lives of those without power are often preserved only in fragments, rumors, and assumptions. By piecing together these fragments, we attempt to honor not just the story of alleged crime, but the human reality of a woman who lived, labored, and endured under a system designed to erase her very existence.